Chalk River, Ontario, 12 December 1952, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The NRX research reactor is scheduled for low-power control tests, routine work, standard procedures. Within minutes, a misset air supply and human error defeat shutdown logic. Several shut-off rods fail to insert fully. Power surges into the tens of megawatts before operators dump the heavy water moderator, forcing the reactor subcritical. The fission chain stops, but the radiological emergency begins below the core. Approximately 1 million gallons of contaminated cooling water floods the basement, carrying roughly 10,000 curies of fission products from ruptured fuel. 6 years later, a neighboring reactor, NRU, suffers a fuel handling fire. A broken, burning metallic uranium rod contaminates the hall, driving dose rate peaks in the hundreds of roentgens per hour at hotspots. 2 incidents, 2 reactors. 1 lesson that crossed borders. The numbers, not speculation, drove the response, and a young naval reactors officer would carry those lessons into history. Chalk River Laboratories occupied a stretch of forested land along the Ottawa River, approximately 120 miles northwest of the capital. By 1947, construction crews had cleared ground for what would become Canada's premier nuclear research facility. The site hosted 2 reactors, NRX, the National Research Experimental, and later NRU, the National Research Universal. Both were heavy water moderated, light water cooled machines designed to produce neutron flux for materials testing, isotope production, and fundamental physics. Trained in the logic of neutron balance, and health physics technicians who monitored dose rates and contamination. Design documents assumed that limit switches would reliably indicate rod position and that pneumatic air supplies would remain properly aligned. Operating culture, however, occasionally tolerated temporary interlock bypasses during maintenance or low-power testing, a practice that seemed reasonable when power levels were negligible. A technical note in the pre-accident specifications read, "In such a high-flux reactor, the transient xenon poison may affect the reactivity by 40 millikelvin. The shut-off rods have to cover about 70 millikelvin. The margin existed in the design. What remained to be tested was whether the implementation matched the blueprint. The failure chain that would define 12 December 1952 began not with a single error, but with a convergence. An air service line misset during maintenance, limit switches that failed to show true rod position, and a protocol that permitted certain interlocks to be bypassed temporarily. The margin was on paper. The vulnerability was in the valves, the switches, and the space between procedure and practice. 12 December 1952, mid-afternoon. The NRX control room was prepared for a low-power test of control systems. Operators followed a checklist. Rods were to be withdrawn incrementally. Power would remain minimal. The expectation was straightforward, a controlled, measured response to small reactivity changes. At approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the test sequence began. A senior operator initiated rod withdrawal commands. Instruments showed needles beginning to move. Then, within minutes, readings accelerated beyond anticipated levels. Power climbed rapidly, not in the milliwatts expected for a low-power test, but toward tens of megawatts. Alarm lamps illuminated. The senior operator called for immediate rod insertion. Status indicators on the panel showed rods moving to the down position, but the needles kept climbing. Reality diverged from indication. Several rods, affected by a misaligned pneumatic air supply and mechanical binding, did not fully insert. Some rods that should have dropped instead rose slightly or remained partially withdrawn. Local cooling inadequacies in certain fuel channels caused nucleate boiling, adding positive reactivity feedback. Reconstructions would later estimate that reactor power surged to somewhere between 60 and 90 megawatts thermal, far beyond the design point for a research reactor operating under test conditions. The operators made the critical decision: dump the moderator. Heavy water drained rapidly from the calandria into a storage tank below. Within approximately 1 minute, the fission chain reaction ceased. Neutron flux dropped to background. The room fell quieter. The immediate physics crisis was over, but a new emergency had begun beneath their feet. Fuel elements, stressed by rapid power changes and inadequate cooling, had failed. Uranium oxide and metal fragments mixed with cooling water, tubes ruptured, headers breached, contaminated water, a mixture of heavy water moderator and light water coolant, poured into the basement, carrying dissolved and suspended fission products. An official report would later state, 10,000 curies of fission products were carried by a flood of 1 million gallons of cooling water into the basement. The number was precise, derived from sample analysis and inventory estimates. 1 million United States gallons, approximately 3,800 cubic meters, now sat below the reactor, radioactive and uncontained. Health physics technicians entered the building perimeter with survey instruments. Airborne activity alarms sounded near ventilation pathways. Portable monitors registered counts climbing beyond normal background. Evacuation orders were issued for non-essential personnel. The building was cordoned. The physics had been stopped by procedure. The contamination, however, moved by gravity and pressure, and it would define the days ahead. 12 December afternoon and evening. The basement of the NRX building was flooding. Pumps ran continuously, but the contaminated inventory overwhelmed temporary holding capacity. Outside, temperatures hovered near freezing. Weather-constrained options. On-site storage tanks could not accommodate the volume or the activity concentration. Health physics teams established control zones. Entry required protective clothing, dosimetry, and strict time limits. Air sampling confirmed elevated concentrations of iodine, xenon, and particulate fission products in pathways connected to the basement. Ventilation systems were adjusted to create negative pressure differentials, preventing contaminated air from spreading into occupied areas. Temporary exhaust routes were improvised using flexible ducting and portable blowers. Within days, AECL engineers convened an emergency planning group. The decision was made: construct a temporary pipeline to transfer the entire contaminated water inventory from the basement sumps to a designated waste disposal area on the site periphery. The distance was measured. The route was surveyed. Ground crews began work. Cold weather complicated excavation. Insulated pipe sections were laid in trenches. Pumps were staged at intervals. Within approximately 10 days of the accident, the pipeline was operational. Controlled transfer began. The 1 million gallon inventory, carrying its burden of roughly 10,000 curies, moved slowly through the pipeline toward engineered trenches designed to isolate the waste from groundwater pathways. A technical summary later recorded, 1 million gallons containing 10,000 curies were then pumped through an emergency pipeline to a waste management area. The operation was methodical. Flow rates were monitored. Sample points along the route confirmed containment. No breaches were detected. Inside the NRX building, ventilation control reduced airborne contamination levels. Radiation surveys guided access. Areas were marked by dose rate: green for unrestricted, yellow for controlled, red for entry only under strict protocols. Smear samples from floors and walls showed surface contamination concentrations that required fixatives, chemical coatings to bind particles and prevent resuspension. The acute emergency phase, defined by uncontrolled contamination spread, was closing. The pipeline had converted a site-wide crisis into a managed waste transfer problem, but the reactor vessel itself remained damaged. Fuel debris, oxide fragments, and activated structural materials sat inside the calandria. Radiation fields near the tank ranged from tens to hundreds of roentgens per hour, depending on proximity to the most damaged regions. The next phase would be longer and more labor-intensive, remotely disassembling the core, extracting damaged fuel, decontaminating surfaces, and rebuilding confidence in the shutdown systems that had failed. The calendar would measure months, not days. Late 1952 into 1953. Inside the NRX reactor hall, work crews assembled equipment for the long decontamination campaign. A trolley held lead glass viewing ports. Racks of remote tools were labeled by function: tube cut, grapple, vacuum pickup. Each tool had been designed or adapted for work in radiation fields that precluded direct human access. The calandria held melted fuel, fractured tubes, and oxide debris. Radiation surveys confirmed dose rates in the hundreds of roentgens per hour near the most contaminated sections. Entry time for any worker would be measured in minutes or seconds before reaching annual dose limits. The solution was remote operation. Tools manipulated from behind shielding, with operators relying on periscopes, mirrors, and careful choreography. Fuel extraction proceeded in stages. Remote shears cut through damaged aluminum tubes. Grapples lifted fragments into shielded containers. Filtered vacuum systems captured fine oxide particles from surfaces. Each operation was timed. Health physics staff tracked cumulative dose for every individual entering the controlled area, even briefly. Shielding was improvised and refined. Lead bricks, steel plates, and graded density materials were stacked to create barriers between workers and the most intense sources. Time motion studies guided work plans, maximum task efficiency per unit of radiation exposure. Drums were filled with contaminated debris, sealed, labeled by activity class, and moved to interim storage. Periodic air sampling above the calandria checked for volatile fission products, iodine isotopes and xenon, that could indicate ongoing release from damaged fuel. Concentrations declined as the most active fragments were removed. Surface decontamination followed source removal. Walls and floors were scrubbed, coated with fixatives, or stripped where contamination penetrated porous materials. The process consumed months. Dose records accumulated. Every worker's exposure was logged. By mid-1953, the reactor hall had been restored to radiation levels permissive of normal access for maintenance and inspection. The calandria was empty, surveyed, and cleared for rebuild. But the technical work was only part of the response. A parallel effort was underway, investigating the root causes and rewriting operating procedures to ensure that the failure chain of 12 December would not repeat. Engineering reviews focused on the pneumatic rod drive system, the limit switches that had provided false position indications, and the protocols that had allowed temporary interlock bypasses. By 1957, new control system specifications were published. The doctrine was clear: no bypass of rod position interlocks without independent verification. Ambiguous rod status would trigger an immediate moderator dump. No debate, no delay. The margin that had existed on paper now had procedural enforcement. 1953 through 1957. AECL's technical leadership undertook a comprehensive review of the 12 December accident. The official accident reports, designated Parts 1 and 2, were authored by senior staff including W.B. Lewis and D.G. Hurst. These documents detailed the sequence: the misset air supply, the spurious rod motions, the inadequate status indication, and the operator's decision to dump the moderator. The reports identified latent weaknesses in design implementation. Pneumatic rod drives relied on air pressure and mechanical linkages that could fail or misalign. Limit switches, intended to prove rod position, could provide false readings if mechanical binding prevented full travel. Operating culture had permitted temporary bypasses during low-power testing, an expedient that seemed safe under normal conditions, but became critical under transient scenarios. The revised 1957 specification for the NRX reactor control system codified new requirements. Interlocks on rod motion could not be bypassed without independent confirmation of system status by health physics or engineering staff. Ambiguous rod indication, any discrepancy between commanded position and measured position, would mandate immediate moderator dump. The threshold for intervention was lowered. Operators were trained to favor early conservative action over waiting for definitive diagnosis. Pneumatic logic was redesigned. Redundant position sensors were installed. Air supply configurations were locked and verified before any power operation. Periodic functional tests of rod drop capability became mandatory. The changes were not optional recommendations, they were enforceable operating conditions. The doctrine extended beyond Chalk River. Research reactors in other countries reviewed the AECL reports. Similar facilities with heavy water moderators and pneumatic control systems adopted parallel upgrades. The NRX accident became a case study in latent error propagation, how multiple small failures, individually manageable, could combine under transient conditions to defeat margins that appeared robust in steady-state analysis. By the late 1950s, dump on ambiguity was a recognized principle in research reactor operation. The phrase appeared in training materials, startup checklists, and emergency procedure guides. It represented a shift in philosophy, from reliance on design margins to active early intervention when those margins came into question. But procedural discipline in reactor control was only half the story. The second Chalk River lesson, fuel handling, remained to be written. NRX had demonstrated what happened when core cooling failed during operation. The next event would show what happened when damaged fuel lost cooling during removal, and that event would take place not in NRX but in its newer higher flux sibling, NRU, 1957 into early 1958. The National Research Universal Reactor, NRU, came online as Canada's most advanced research machine. It was a heavy water-moderated, light water-cooled tank reactor, similar in principle to NRX but designed for higher neutron flux. The mission was materials testing and isotope production. Targets included cobalt-60 for medical and industrial applications, and experimental fuel samples for reactor development programs. The higher flux meant higher power density in the core. Fuel elements, metallic uranium clad in aluminum, experienced greater thermal and radiation stress. Occasional sheath failures were anticipated. Procedures existed for removing damaged elements. Extract the fuel rod using the overhead crane, transfer it into a water-cooled flask for decay and inspection, and move the flask to a maintenance pit for disassembly or disposal. Commissioning photographs from 1957 show the NRU reactor hall, a clean, well-lit industrial space. The reactor tank occupies the center. Overhead, the crane rails run the length of the building. Along the perimeter, maintenance pits allow servicing of equipment and temporary storage of flasks. The design promised throughput, short turnaround times for high-value targets, rapid fuel handling to maximize utilization. Early operations confirmed the reactor's performance. Neutron flux met specifications. Isotope yields were high. But the pace of work stressed fuel handling interfaces. Coolant activity monitors on certain channels showed elevated readings, indicating potential sheath failures. Logs noted several instances of damaged elements awaiting removal. The term appeared routine. Procedures were straightforward. Crews had completed similar extractions dozens of times. What the logs did not emphasize, because it was understood but not always viscerally appreciated, was the pyrophoric nature of metallic uranium. When wet and cool, uranium metal is stable. When dry and exposed to air, especially if the surface is freshly fractured or oxidized incompletely, uranium can ignite spontaneously. The heat of combustion is intense. The resulting uranium oxide disperses as fine particles, an inhalation hazard and a contamination source. Fuel handling procedures assumed continuous water contact during extraction, but procedures also assumed that elements would come out intact or at least manageable. The assumption was reasonable for most cases. It would not hold for the elements scheduled for removal on 24 May 1958. The reactor, the crane, the flask, and the maintenance pit were ready. The fuel rod was damaged. The extraction was routine, until it wasn't. 24 May 1958, late morning. The NRU control room logged a reactor trip, an automatic shutdown triggered by elevated coolant activity. Post-trip inspection confirmed what operators suspected. A fuel element in one of the high-flux channels had developed a sheath failure. The decision was made to remove the melt aluminum cladding and propagate through the metal core. Smoke and aerosol, fine uranium oxide particles, spread into the hall and adjacent areas. Emergency response was swift but improvised. Wetted sand, pre-staged near the pit for such contingencies, was applied to smother the burning fragment. Additional water was directed carefully. Too much water on hot uranium metal can produce hydrogen, compounding the hazard. The fire burned for approximately 15 minutes before it was fully extinguished. Radiation surveys conducted immediately afterward showed severe localized contamination. The maintenance pit and surrounding floor areas registered counts far above background. Airborne monitors detected elevated concentrations of uranium oxide particles. Ventilation was adjusted to confine the spread. Access to the reactor hall was restricted. Only essential personnel in full protective equipment were permitted entry. An official summary later stated, "Radioactive fission products were spread when a piece of the fuel rod fell into the maintenance pit and burned." The language was factual. The operational consequence was stark, a building-wide contamination event with dose rates that would challenge every aspect of radiation protection practice. The fire was out. The fuel fragment was cooling in sand. But the radiation fields in the NRU hull were only beginning to be understood, and they would prove far worse than initial estimates suggested. Late May through June 1958. Health physics teams conducted comprehensive surveys of the NRU building. Radiation fields near the maintenance pit registered in the hundreds of Roentgens per hour. Some localized hotspots approached or exceeded 1,000 Roentgens per hour, dose rates at which a worker could receive a year's occupational limit in minutes or even seconds. The immediate problem was debris removal. The burning fuel fragment had scattered uranium oxide across the pit floor and onto adjacent surfaces. Sand used to extinguish the fire was now contaminated. Aerosol deposition coated walls, ducts, and overhead structures. Each contaminated surface contributed to the integrated dose field. Reducing those fields required physically removing the sources, but the sources themselves were the reason no one could safely remain in the area. The solution was strict rotation. Work crews were organized into teams. Each individual was assigned a specific task: lift one sandbag, place one shield plate, apply fixative to one marked section of wall. Entry times were calculated: 90 seconds for a task near a moderate field, 60 seconds for work at a hotspot, sometimes as little as 30 seconds for the highest intensity locations. A whiteboard outside the hall tracked entries. Names appeared beside timestamps and dose estimates. Dosimeters were checked after every entry. If an individual approached their weekly or monthly limit, they were removed from the rotation. Replacement workers stepped in. The work continued. Protective equipment provided minimal shielding against gamma radiation at these intensities. The only effective controls were time and distance. Temporary lead and steel barriers were positioned to reduce dose rates along access paths. Workers approached hotspots from behind these improvised shields, completed their task, and withdrew immediately. Over the course of the cleanup campaign, dose records accumulated. Post-campaign analysis, published in later AECL follow-up studies, documented the outcomes. Approximately 1,200 individuals participated across AECL staff, military personnel, civil defense volunteers, and contractors. The majority received doses well within annual limits. 14 individuals exceeded 5 rem, 50 millisieverts. A smaller number received higher doses. 2 individuals recorded approximately 0.1 sievert each. One recorded 0.19 sieverts, 19 rem. The statistics reflected the reality of dose management under extreme conditions. Disciplined rotation kept most exposures low, but the work demanded that some individuals absorb higher doses to knock down hotspots and make the hall workable for subsequent decontamination phases. June through August 1958. With the most intense hotspots reduced through targeted source removal, the NRU reactor hall transitioned to bulk decontamination. Dose rates in accessible areas dropped from hundreds of Roentgens per hour to single-digit or low double-digit values, still elevated, but manageable with proper controls and time limits. The decontamination strategy was systematic. Overhead structures and ventilation ducts were cleaned first to prevent recontamination of lower surfaces. Walls were scrubbed with detergents or coated with fixative compounds to bind residual particles. Floors were stripped where contamination had penetrated porous concrete. Waste was packaged in drums labeled by activity level and transferred to interim storage. Survey teams followed close behind. Smear samples confirmed surface contamination levels. Fixed contamination, particles bound tightly to surfaces, posed less immediate hazard than loose contamination, which could be resuspended or transferred by contact. Clearance criteria were defined. Surfaces had to meet specific activity limits before the area could be released for normal work. Approximately 300 AECL core decontamination staff worked alongside contractors and support personnel. The military contributed logistics and labor. Civil defense volunteers assisted with perimeter control and supply transport. The campaign required coordination across disciplines: health physics for dose control, engineering for equipment reliability, operations for eventual reactor restart. Overhead crane systems were disassembled, decontaminated, inspected, and reassembled. Fuel handling tools were examined for damage or contamination. Water-cooled flasks used in the aborted extraction were drained, surveyed, and recertified. Maintenance pits were cleaned and lined with fresh coatings. Every component involved in fuel handling received enhanced scrutiny. By late August, approximately 2.5 months after the 24 May fire, the NRU reactor hall met clearance criteria. Smear tests showed contamination levels consistent with resumption of operations. Radiation fields were low enough to permit routine maintenance and fuel handling under standard protective measures. The reactor was restarted. A summary published years later recorded, AECL staff and others completed the decontamination in 2.5 months. The timeline reflected disciplined execution. Measurement-driven sequencing, remove the sources first, then clean, then verify, proved more effective than aggressive calendar-driven schedules that might have cut corners. The technical success, however, left an open question. What would be the long-term health outcomes for the workers who had absorbed elevated doses during the initial hotspot phase? The answer would require years of follow-up and statistical analysis. 1953 through 1958. The NRX accident of 12 December 1952 drove doctrine changes that rippled through research reactor operations worldwide. The official accident reports, Parts 1 and 2, became required reading for reactor operators, control system designers, and regulatory staff. The lessons were distilled into enforceable rules. The core principle was dump on ambiguity. If rod position could not be verified independently, if limit switches disagreed with commands, if pneumatic pressure readings were inconsistent, if any aspect of the shutdown system showed unexpected behavior, the operator's immediate action was to dump the moderator. No diagnostic delay. No waiting for additional confirmation. The design philosophy shifted from trusting interlocks to verifying them actively and frequently. Pneumatic rod drive systems were re-engineered. Air supply lines were fitted with locks and visual indicators. Redundant position sensors provided independent confirmation of rod travel. Functional tests of rod drop capability became part of every startup sequence. Limit switches were upgraded to fail-safe designs. Maintenance procedures forbade any bypass of rod interlocks without direct oversight by engineering and health physics staff. Training emphasized the latent error chain. Operators learned to recognize that multiple small failures, individually below the threshold for alarm, could combine under transient conditions to defeat design margins. The NRX accident demonstrated that a reactor could appear safe, with rods indicating down, and procedures followed, while reality diverged invisibly until power excursion forced the truth into the open. By 1957, the revised control system specification for NRX was published. The document incorporated all lessons from the 12 December event. Similar specifications were adopted at other research reactors. International conferences on reactor safety featured Chalk River case studies. The AECL accident reports were cited in safety analyses from the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and other nations developing research and test reactors. The doctrine covered reactor startups. It formalized shutdown logic, but it did not yet address fuel handling, the domain where the NRU fire had revealed the next failure mode. Procedures for damaged fuel extraction would require their own revision, emphasizing continuous cooling, pre-staged fire suppression, and enhanced monitoring during handling operations. The NRU lessons would follow the NRX lessons into the international safety canon. 2 accidents, 6 years apart, had rewritten the rules for research reactor operations. What remained was to assess the human cost and confirm that disciplined dose control had worked. Summer through autumn 1958, with the NRU reactor hall cleared and operations resuming, attention turned to evaluating the dose outcomes. Approximately 1,200 individuals had participated in the cleanup. Each had warned dosimetry. Records were compiled, analyzed, and compared against regulatory limits and expected population exposures. The histogram showed a distribution typical of well-managed emergency work. The majority of participants, roughly 80 to 90%, received doses below the annual occupational limit of 5 rem per year. These individuals had worked in lower field areas, participated in bulk decontamination, after hotspots were reduced or rotated through brief entries that kept cumulative exposure low. A smaller group, 14 individuals, exceeded 5 rem over the course of the campaign. 2 individuals recorded doses near 0.1 sievert. 1 individual reached 0.19 sieverts, the highest single dose recorded. These were the workers who had entered the highest field areas during the initial debris removal phase. When dose rates at hotspots approached or exceeded 1,000 roentgens per hour and entry times were measured in tens of seconds, the doses were documented, not hidden. They reflected calculated decisions. Knock down the most intense sources first, using strict time limits and rotation discipline to bring average fields low enough for sustained decontamination work. The alternative, attempting bulk decontamination with hotspots in place, would have prolonged the campaign and spread doses more widely across a larger workforce. Field measurements validated the strategy. After hotspot removal, dose rates in the NRU hall dropped to a few roentgens per hour, still requiring controls, but permissive of the minutes-long entries necessary for scrubbing, coating, and verification. The measured decline in dose rates matched predictions based on source removal calculations. Restart occurred approximately 2.5 months after the fire. The timeline beat pessimistic projections that had anticipated shutdowns lasting 6 months or more. Measurement-driven execution, survey, prioritize, remove, verify, proved faster than calendar-driven goals that might have accepted incomplete decontamination or relaxed clearance standards. But the immediate dose data could not answer the most important question: would the elevated exposures lead to late health effects? Radiation-induced cancers and other diseases typically manifest years or decades after exposure. A long-term cohort follow-up study was initiated to track the health outcomes of cleanup participants over time, 1952 through the early 1960s. The NRX accident drew immediate attention from reactor programs in Allied nations. The United States Navy, in particular, followed developments closely. Naval Reactors, the organization responsible for propulsion reactors on submarines and surface ships, recognized that its own personnel might face similar contamination scenarios during maintenance, refueling, or accident response. In the weeks and months following 12 December 1952, U.S. Naval Reactors personnel visited Chalk River. They observed the cleanup operations, they studied the time-limited entry protocols, they reviewed dose records and contamination control methods. The practices developed under emergency conditions at NRX, pre-staged tooling, seconds-based rotations, mock-up training to minimize in-field time, were adapted into U.S. training programs. Among the Naval Reactors officers who engaged with the Chalk River, cleanup was a young lieutenant named James Earl Carter, Jr. Carter, a Naval Academy graduate with training in reactor technology, was part of the cohort assigned to support the NRX response during a limited period in late 1952 or early 1953. Public retrospectives and professional society accounts note his participation. Details of his specific duties and dose remain general in unclassified sources. What is documented is that the experience informed his later perspectives on nuclear technology and safety. The transfer of knowledge was not limited to individual personnel. Formal training materials incorporated Chalk River lessons. Mock-up facilities, full-scale replicas of reactor compartments, were constructed to allow dry runs of maintenance and emergency procedures. Workers practiced tasks under simulated high-field conditions, optimizing movements to minimize time and maximize task completion per entry. Standardized contamination control practices emerged: entry and exit frisk points, protective clothing protocols, zoning by dose rate, real-time dosimetry monitoring. These became routine in U.S. nuclear Navy operations and extended into civilian reactor programs. The doctrine of time-limited entries, shield staging, and measurement-driven work planning became portable across national and institutional boundaries. By the early 1960s, Chalk River's influence was embedded in international reactor safety culture. 2 accidents had taught lessons that no amount of theoretical analysis could have captured: the operational reality, how systems failed, how contamination spread, how dose accumulated, had to be lived, measured, and documented before it could be systematically prevented. 1959 through 1982. The long-term health follow-up of NRU cleanup participants proceeded quietly, away from public attention. AECL maintained a registry of individuals who had worked on the decontamination campaign. Dose records were preserved. Vital statistics, Deaths, causes of death, were tracked through national health registries. The cohort comprised approximately 832 AECL employees who had participated in the cleanup, plus military and contract personnel. Cumulative dose distributions were known. The question was whether elevated exposures, particularly among the 14 individuals who exceeded 5 rem, would correlate with increased mortality from cancer or other radiation-associated diseases. By the early 1980s, sufficient time had elapsed for initial analysis limitations. Smaller excess risks could be masked by statistical uncertainty. Longer follow-up might detect late-onset cancers not yet apparent by 1982. Non-cancer effects, cardiovascular disease for instance, might require different analytical approaches. But within the scope and power of the analysis, the data supported the conclusion that disciplined dose control and rotation had kept exposures below thresholds for detectable population-level harm. The human health loop, opened in May 1958, closed 2.5 decades later with data rather than speculation. The engineering loop, procedures, interlocks, fuel handling protocols had closed years earlier as revised specifications and training programs propagated through reactor operations worldwide. What remained was memory. The documented record of how 2 accidents at Chalk River reshaped nuclear safety practice and left a legacy measured not in narratives, but in numbers. 1953 to the present. Walk into any research reactor control room today and compare the startup checklist to pre-1952 practice. The differences are not decorative, they are operational. Rod position must be independently verified before any power change. Interlocks cannot be bypassed without logged supervisory approval and redundant checks. Ambiguous status triggers immediate shutdown actions. Dump moderator, insert backup rods, verify subcriticality by independent neutron counts. These are not recommendations. They are operating license conditions, enforced by regulators and embedded in control system hardware. The NRX accident of 12 December 1952 demonstrated that design margins are meaningless if status indication is wrong and air supplies are misaligned. Procedures now assume that interfaces between mechanical systems, between instrument readings and physical reality are where failures concentrate. Fuel handling specifications reflect the lessons of 24 May 1958. Damaged fuel must remain wetted throughout extraction. Pyrophoric material fire suppression, wetted sand, inert gas blanketing must be pre-staged. Operators are trained on uranium combustion hazards, not as abstract theory, but through case studies with photographs, dose reconstructions, and witness accounts. Waste management practices, including emergency pipeline construction and controlled ground disposal, entered the technical literature through Chalk River's example. The United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, UNSEER, documented Chalk River's waste handling methods in its 1958 annex as part of the baseline for international practice. Temporary pipelines, activity monitoring during transfer, and engineered disposal trenches became recognized tools for large-volume contaminated water management. Mock-up training facilities, where workers practice tasks on non-radioactive replicas before entering high-field areas, are now standard in reactor maintenance programs. The time-limited entry doctrine, refined during NRU decontamination, is taught to every health physics technician and nuclear worker. Dose histograms from cleanup campaigns are reviewed in professional courses as benchmarks for rotation discipline. The 2 Chalk River incidents produced no monuments, no memorial plaques visible to the public. What endures is procedural, enforceable rules, verified interlocks, measured responses. Design promised containment. The monitors told a different story. And the numbers, dose rates, activity concentrations, entry times, clearance surveys, changed how research reactors are operated, maintained, and made safe.